There's a strange silence inside you that you've learned to live with. It hides beneath the noise of your daily life, behind every conversation, every goal, every distraction. It's not the kind of silence that comes from peace. It's the silence of something forgotten, something buried deep that still whispers from below the surface. You might feel it when you're alone at night, when your mind is too tired to pretend. That subtle ache, that vague anxiety, that endless repetition of mistakes and patterns, as if your life keeps looping through the same emotional pain in different disguises. Freud would have called this your unconscious speaking, the hidden part of you that refuses to stay quiet, no matter how hard you try to silence it. Freud predicted most of the psychological problems we struggle with today. Long before self-help books, before social media, before therapy became mainstream, he warned that humanity would increasingly suffer from an inner disconnection, from repression, emotional avoidance, and the illusion of control. He said that the price of civilization was the suppression of instinct, that our progress as a species would depend on our ability to deny what is wild, raw, and irrational inside us. But in that denial, we would lose something essential, the capacity to truly feel, to truly know ourselves. So we became experts at pretending. We pretend to be okay. We pretend to have moved on. We pretend that logic and productivity can heal what emotion has wounded. Yet beneath our rational masks, the unconscious keeps working. It transforms our unspoken desires into dreams, our unresolved conflicts into anxiety, our repressed pain into psychosomatic symptoms. Freud once said, "Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways." Maybe that's why you sometimes explode without knowing why, or why you find yourself attracted to people who hurt you in the same ways you were hurt before, or why success feels empty even when you finally achieve it. These are not coincidences. These are messages from the parts of yourself that you've banished to the dark. Freud believed that the human being is not a master of their own house, that within us lives another, older consciousness made of everything we've tried to forget. If you're listening to this, maybe some part of you already knows this truth. Maybe you felt that your worst problems don't come from the outside world, but from a quiet war happening inside, a conflict between who you are and who you were forced to be, between what you want and what you think you should want, between the free, instinctual self that was born and the obedient self that society demanded. Freud called this tension the struggle between the id, ego, and superego. But in simpler terms, it's the fight between desire, reality, and morality. Every psychological symptom, he believed, was born from that invisible battlefield. And perhaps your greatest suffering is not knowing which voice inside you to trust. Before we go further, I want to pause for a moment. If this resonates with you, if you've ever felt that invisible tension pulling your life in two directions, I invite you to share it in the comments. Sometimes the act of naming what we feel is the first step to healing. You can even write, "I'm learning to listen to the silence inside me." Copy that line if it speaks to you. Your story might help someone else recognize their own. Let's continue. Freud's insight was both revolutionary and unsettling, that we are strangers to ourselves. We think we know why we do what we do, but our consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lies the submerged continent of forgotten memories, forbidden desires, and unresolved emotions, the true architects of our behavior. Most people spend their lives trying to control symptoms without understanding their roots. They chase happiness through consumption, relationships, or achievements, hoping that if they fill the emptiness with enough noise, it will disappear. But repression doesn't heal the wound, it only pushes it deeper where it festers. Freud saw this everywhere, in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in the illnesses of his patients. What we call mistakes are often messages. What we call bad habits are ways of coping with what our conscious mind refuses to face. That's why, To truly heal, we must listen to what the symptom is trying to say. The symptom is the voice of the repressed. Anxiety, depression, obsessive thinking, they are all forms of communication from the unconscious. When we suffer, the psyche is trying to bring something back to awareness. It's not punishing us, it's inviting us to look within. Imagine your unconscious as a child, locked in the basement of your mind. That child still remembers everything, every humiliation, every rejection, every moment when you learned it was safer to hide your feelings. You grew up, but that part of you stayed frozen in time, waiting to be seen again. Every time you ignore your emotions, you're closing the door on that child. But every time you dream, every time you slip, every time you overreact to something small, it's that child knocking, begging you to open the door. Freud's entire work was a call to courage, the courage to look inward, to face the truth of one's own desires and fears without judgment. He knew that our worst psychological problems are not caused by what happens to us, but by what we refuse to feel. He warned that if we keep living in denial, the unconscious will find darker ways to express itself. The body might speak through illness. The mind might create self-sabotage. Our relationships might repeat the same trauma over and over until we finally listen. The tragedy is that most people never do. We live in a culture that teaches us to fix, not to feel, to move on, not to understand. We scroll, we distract, we rationalize, we label, but rarely do we sit with the raw truth of what hurts. Freud believed that healing begins when repression ends, when we allow the forbidden emotions to return, to be seen and integrated. That's what he called the talking cure. Not because talking itself was magical, but because speech gives form to what was once buried. When we speak the unspeakable, we reclaim power over it. Think of how many times you've said, "I don't know why I feel this way." Freud would say, "You do know, but you've hidden it too well." Part 2 will continue from here, exploring how Freud's ideas can help us avoid the worst psychological traps of modern life. Repression disguised as strength, projection disguised as morality, and repetition disguised as fate. When Freud looked at the human mind, he didn't see evil or weakness in our impulses. He saw truth. He saw that our most irrational desires were not to be destroyed, but understood. Because every desire, no matter how shameful or primitive it may seem, carries the story of something we once needed but could not have. The child who wasn't loved enough learns to crave validation in every adult relationship. The one who felt invisible learns to perform, to please, to become whoever others need them to be. The one who was controlled learns to rebel, to sabotage anything that feels like authority. These are not random traits. They are the echoes of unmet needs. Freud would say that to understand yourself, you must listen to the way your pain disguises itself. You might call it perfectionism or anxiety or detachment, but underneath there is always a deeper emotion trying to surface. Shame, longing, fear, anger. Modern psychology has given new names to Freud's discoveries, but the essence remains the same. What we repress does not disappear. It becomes our personality. This is why avoidance feels safe but always ends up costing more than we expect. The moment we refuse to feel something, that feeling doesn't die. It becomes a force in the shadows, shaping our choices, our attractions, our mistakes. It becomes the invisible script of our lives. How many of your choices were truly free? How many of them were unconscious attempts to repeat an old story, hoping for a different ending? Freud called this repetition compulsion, the tragic tendency to recreate the very pain we never healed in an unconscious effort to master it this time. You fall for people who don't choose you because you once learned to earn love that was never freely given. You chase success because once you felt worthless without it. You fear being alone because solitude reminds you of a time when you were abandoned. These are not flaws. They are the psyche's way of trying to rewrite its own past. But until we see the pattern, we keep replaying the same emotional movie, thinking the ending might change. Freud didn't just diagnose this, he offered a way out, though it was not an easy one. He said the goal of psychoanalysis is not happiness, but freedom. Freedom from the invisible forces that control us, freedom from the tyranny of the unconscious. But to reach that freedom, we must be willing to confront the truth of who we are, including the parts we despise. Healing, in Freud's view, was not about becoming pure, but whole. It meant reclaiming every fragment of yourself, even the dark ones. The worst psychological problems, then, arise when we divide ourselves, when we build walls between the person we pretend to be and the person we actually are. We wear masks to survive, but we forget to take them off. We call the mask me, and the real self becomes a stranger. The longer this division lasts, the more energy we waste maintaining it, until one day the mask cracks, in burnout, in depression, in breakdown. And we call it a crisis, but it's really an unveiling. The unconscious has simply run out of patience. Maybe this is happening to you now. Maybe you've reached a point where your old ways of coping no longer work. You can't numb yourself the way you used to. The distractions don't satisfy you anymore. You feel something breaking down, but also breaking open. That's not weakness, it's awakening. Freud would say the unconscious is knocking, asking to be heard at last. We fear self-knowledge because it threatens our illusions. But what if the illusions are what keep us sick? Freud believed that the first step toward sanity is the willingness to stop lying to ourselves, to admit what we feel, even if it's ugly, to accept what we desire, even if it's inconvenient, to grieve what we lost, even if it's long past. The mind cannot heal while pretending. He often said, "Where it was, their ego shall be," meaning, where the unconscious ruled, consciousness must grow. Healing is the expansion of awareness into the darkness. You cannot avoid your worst psychological problems by running from them. You can only avoid being controlled by them by bringing them into the light. If you've ever wondered why you keep repeating the same emotional cycle, Freud's answer would be simple and terrifying, because a part of you still believes the past can be undone. The child within you still waits for the ending to change, but it won't change until you accept that it already happened. That's when the pattern breaks. When you stop trying to rewrite the past and start writing the present with awareness, and awareness begins with honesty. Pause for a moment and think, which part of yourself are you still hiding from? Which emotion do you keep labeling as bad instead of listening to it? These are not enemies to defeat, but signals to follow. The unconscious doesn't punish, it teaches. It wants to show you what needs to be seen, felt, and forgiven. If any of this touches something in you, I'd love for you to share it in the comments. What is one feeling you've been running from? You can write, "I'm ready to stop pretending and start listening." Copy that if it resonates. Your words might be the permission someone else needs to face their own truth. Now, let's talk about avoidance, the silent epidemic of modern psychology that Freud predicted over a century ago. In Freud's time, repression was considered a moral duty. People avoided their desires to appear civilized. Today, we avoid in different ways. We call it busyness, productivity, hustle. We medicate our anxiety. We distract ourselves with screens. We glorify emotional numbness as resilience. Freud would have seen through it all. He would have said that civilization still demands repression, but now it disguises it as success. The result? A society of high-functioning neurotics, people who look fine but feel empty, who achieve everything except inner peace. Freud warned that as repression grows, so does neurosis. He saw that our psychological suffering would evolve, not disappear. That one day humanity's greatest enemy would not be external war, but the war within, the conflict between authenticity and adaptation. We can't return to instinct, but we also can't live without it. We need a balance between civilization and the soul. That balance is self-awareness. The tragedy of the modern mind is that we've become experts in external knowledge and amateurs in self-knowledge. We analyze everything except ourselves. Freud would ask you, do you know your own motives? Do you know why you choose the people you choose? Why you fear the things you fear? Why you crave the things you crave? Until you do, you're not living freely. You're acting out a script written long ago by someone else. Perhaps your parents, perhaps society, perhaps the unconscious itself. The only way to avoid your worst psychological problems is to stop avoiding yourself. Because all your suffering, anxiety, addiction, obsession, insecurity, is trying to lead you back to one thing: awareness. In part 3, we'll explore how to transform that awareness into healing, how to listen to the unconscious without being ruled by it, how to make peace with your repressed emotions, and how to live with a mind that finally belongs to you. Freud once said that the aim of psychoanalysis is not to make a person perfect, but to make them free, free to love, to work, to feel, to live without being enslaved by what lies unseen. And yet, freedom begins in the most unlikely place, in the acceptance of our own darkness. We spend so much of life trying to become better versions of ourselves, but what if growth doesn't mean becoming better? What if it means becoming whole? When you begin to listen to your unconscious, something strange happens. At first, it feels like chaos. Memories resurface, old emotions reawaken, dreams become vivid and confusing. You might feel like you're regressing, losing control, but in truth, you're returning to yourself. The psyche speaks in symbols, not logic. It doesn't want to punish you. It wants to make you remember. Remember what hurt. Remember what was buried. Remember who you were before you learned to pretend. The problem with most modern approaches to healing is that they try to eliminate pain instead of understanding it. We are taught to medicate, to distract, to fix, but pain is not the enemy. Pain is information. Freud knew that behind every symptom lies a message, a truth the mind has been avoiding. To avoid that message is to stay trapped in the same emotional loops forever. To face it is to finally grow. Think of your mind as a city built over ancient ruins. The skyscrapers of your adult self rise above, solid and proud. But beneath them lie the foundations of everything you once felt, every forgotten emotion, every childhood fear. Most of us live our lives on the surface, pretending those ruins no longer exist. But when the ground begins to shake, through loss, heartbreak, failure, we realize that the old structures are still there, shaping everything we build. Freud would tell you not to panic when the past returns. He would say, "This is your chance." Because awareness is painful at first, but liberating later. The moment you stop running from your inner ruins, you can finally rebuild on solid ground. The cracks in your psyche aren't signs of weakness. They are openings for light. To avoid your worst psychological problems, then, is not to suppress them, but to understand them. Every emotion you repress becomes a problem. Every truth you face becomes a teacher. The work is to transform symptoms into meaning. If you've ever felt like your life is being repeated, like you're living the same story again and again, Freud would call this the return of the repressed. But he'd also say that repetition ends the moment you become conscious of it. Once you see the pattern, you're no longer inside it. You're above it. That's the essence of psychoanalysis, turning the unconscious into consciousness, turning fate into choice. Let's make this real. Imagine someone who grew up with a parent who was emotionally unavailable. As an adult, they might keep falling in love with distant people, trying to earn affection that's always just out of reach. On the surface, it seems like bad luck or bad taste. But deep down, it's the unconscious saying, maybe if I can make this person love me, it will prove I was lovable all along. The present becomes a stage for the past to replay its wounds. The same pattern, again and again. But the moment this person realizes the pattern, truly sees it, something powerful happens. They stop chasing what hurts them. They stop mistaking pain for love. That's when healing begins. Awareness breaks the spell. Freud believed that when you make the unconscious conscious, you stop being a puppet. You stop reacting and start choosing. You stop projecting your pain onto others and start owning it. Projection is one of the defense mechanisms Freud described. The habit of seeing in others what we cannot face in ourselves. The people who irritate you the most often mirror something you've disowned. The traits you admire most often reflect what you secretly long to be. We are all mirrors for each other's unconscious. That's why self-awareness isn't just an act of healing, it's an act of compassion. When you understand your own darkness, you stop judging others for theirs. Freud's vision for humanity was not cold or cynical, as many think. He believed in the possibility of growth, but he knew that real growth requires honesty. To know yourself is to forgive yourself. And forgiveness begins when you stop demanding that your inner world always makes sense. The unconscious is not logical. It's poetic. It speaks in dreams, slips, desires, fears, metaphors. Listening to it is like learning a lost language. But the reward is profound. You become whole again. The irony of our time is that we know more about the universe than we do about our own hearts. We've conquered the external world, but the internal one remains unexplored, avoided, repressed. Freud would look at our society today, the anxiety, the loneliness, the endless search for validation, and he would not be surprised. He would say, "You have built a world that feeds the ego and starves the soul." The more we chase pleasure, the more we lose meaning. The more we run from discomfort, the more it grows. Avoidance is the modern plague. We avoid through consumption, through distraction, through pretending that we are rational creatures who can control everything. But the unconscious does not obey logic. It demands to be felt. If you silence it, it will speak through your body, your dreams, your relationships. If you listen, it will lead you toward healing. Maybe this is why so many of us feel lost. Because we've mistaken repression for maturity, numbness for strength, avoidance for peace. Freud would tell us that healing doesn't look graceful. It's messy, emotional, uncomfortable, but it's real. And once you've looked into your own darkness and survived it, life changes. The world outside still hurts, but it no longer defines you. The silence inside becomes a friend, not a threat. Take a breath. You've come a long way in this reflection. You've explored the parts of yourself that most people spend a lifetime avoiding. That alone is courage. But remember, awareness is not the end. It's the beginning. Once you see your patterns, your task is to live differently. To act with consciousness where you once acted from compulsion. To feel where you once shut down. To speak where you once stayed silent. Freud predicted that the greatest suffering of the future would come from the loss of meaning, from people who are materially comfortable but emotionally starved. The antidote is not more pleasure, but more depth. To live deeply is to live with awareness of your inner world, to integrate the conscious and the unconscious, to accept that light and shadow coexist. You don't have to eliminate your darkness to be whole. You just have to stop fighting it. If this journey has stirred something in you, take a moment to share it below. You can write, "I'm learning to make peace with my shadow." Copy that if it speaks to you. It's not just a comment, it's a declaration. It means you're no longer running. You're beginning to listen. And that is the essence of Freud's message, that every symptom, every dream, every moment of suffering carries a hidden invitation to become more conscious. The unconscious is not your enemy. It's your oldest friend, waiting for you to finally turn toward it and say, "I'm ready to listen." Before we end, if you've found something meaningful in this journey, consider subscribing. This space is for people who are tired of pretending, who want to understand their minds and hearts more deeply, who believe that true healing begins with self-awareness. No pressure, no false promises, just honest reflection every week. Freud once wrote, "Out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength." And that might be the most important prediction he ever made. Because your greatest psychological problems are not signs of failure. They are signs that your psyche is trying to wake you up, to reconnect you with the parts you've lost, to make you whole again. So stop running from your pain. It's not chasing you to harm you. It's chasing you to be healed.